We think of history as a stage for heroes and villains, but more often than not, it is just a desperate scramble for cash by men who have borrowed more than they can pay back. This is Tom from the Collapse Log, exploring the rise and fall of empires. Because behind every golden age lies a quiet decay no one sees until it is too late. When we look at the marble statues of antiquity, we see the stoic faces of conquerors. We see the laurel wreaths and the armor and the scrolls of law. We see Julius Caesar as the ultimate symbol of military genius and political ambition. We are taught that he destroyed the Roman Republic because he wanted to be a king. We are taught that he crossed the Rubicon because of his massive ego and his desire for glory. But there is a different story hidden in the ledgers of the Roman banks. There is a story that doesn't appear in the heroic poems, but appears in the private letters of the time. It is a story that reveals that Julius Caesar was not just a general. He was the most indebted man in the history of the world. The truth about the fall of the Roman Republic is that it was a financial crisis masquerading as a political war, and the man at the center of it crossed the river and started a civil war, not because he was brave, but because he was broke. He was a man running from his creditors, and the only place he could run was towards the capital city at the head of an army. To understand why Caesar destroyed the Republic, we have to understand how the Roman political system worked in the 1st century BC. We like to imagine that Rome was a noble place where the best man won. But in reality, the late Republic was a kleptocracy. It was a system ruled by money. If you wanted to be elected to office, you didn't just give speeches. You bought votes. It was an open secret. There were actual agents who worked in the city whose entire job was to distribute bribes to the tribes of Rome. If you wanted to be a consul or a praetor, you had to pay. And Julius Caesar wanted to be at the top. But he had a problem. He was born into an old aristocratic family, but they were not rich. They had a famous name, but empty pockets. So to fund his rise, Caesar did what modern governments do. He borrowed. He borrowed on a scale that is almost impossible to comprehend. When he was a young man rising through the ranks, he spent money like water. He knew that to get ahead, he had to be popular, and to be popular, he had to entertain the people. When he was elected, Adil, the official in charge of public buildings and festivals, he threw the most lavish games Rome had ever seen. He put hundreds of gladiators in the arena. He decorated the Capitol with silver. He held massive feasts for the public. The people loved him. They cheered his name. They voted for him. But every single cup of wine and every single gladiator was paid for with borrowed money. Caesar was betting on his own future. He was taking out massive loans with high interest rates, gambling that he would eventually win a high office. By the time he was ready to leave for his first governorship in Spain, his debts were so massive that his creditors tried to stop him from leaving the city. They filed lawsuits. They demanded payment. They threatened to seize his baggage and his equipment. Caesar was trapped. He had the title of governor, but he couldn't leave Rome because he was insolvent. He was saved only by the intervention of Marcus Crassus, the richest man in Rome. Crassus acted as a guarantor for Caesar's debts. He paid off the most aggressive creditors and promised to cover the rest. Crassus didn't do this out of kindness. He did it because he owned Caesar. He bought the most promising politician in Rome. This moment taught Caesar a lesson that he would never forget. Debt is slavery. As long as he owed money, he was not a free man. He went to Spain and he acted like a man desperate for cash. He launched military campaigns against the local tribes, not for the security of Rome, but to loot their cities. He needed gold. He needed silver. He needed slaves to sell. He came back from Spain with enough money to pay off some debt, but not all of it. Then came the big prize, the consulship and the command in Gaul. This was Caesar's Hail Mary pass. He knew that if he could conquer Gaul, he could loot enough wealth to pay off his debts forever and become the richest man in Rome. The Gallic Wars, which lasted for 8 years, were a military triumph. We read about the battles and the sieges. We read about Vercingetorix and the legions. But underneath the military strategy was a massive looting operation. Caesar stripped Gaul bare. He sacked cities. He melted down the sacred treasures of the Gallic temples. He enslaved roughly 1 million people. selling 1,000,000 human beings into slavery, generated a tidal wave of cash. The amount of gold he sent back to Rome was so massive that it actually caused inflation. The price of gold in Italy dropped because Caesar flooded the market. He used this money to pay his soldiers generous bonuses, ensuring their loyalty. He used it to build massive public works in Rome to keep the people happy. And he used it to pay off his creditors. For a moment it seemed like the gamble had worked. He had borrowed millions, he had spent it on power. He had used the power to get an army. And he had used the army to steal the money to pay back the loans. It was a perfect circle of corruption. But then the music stopped. The term of his governorship was ending. In the Roman system, a holder of high office like a governor or a consul had legal immunity. You could not be prosecuted while you held the imperium, the power of command. But the moment you laid down your command and became a private citizen, you were vulnerable. Caesar had made many enemies during his rise. He had bribed his way to power. He had broken laws. He had ignored the Senate. The conservative faction in the Senate, led by men like Cato the Younger and allied with Pompey the Great, had been waiting for years for this moment. They knew they couldn't defeat Caesar on the battlefield, so they planned to defeat him in the courts. They made it clear that the day Caesar returned to Rome as a private citizen, he would be slapped with dozens of lawsuits. They would accuse him of bribery. They would accuse him of war crimes in Gaul. They would accuse him of treason, and they would win. The courts were controlled by his enemies. The penalty would be total ruin. He would be exiled. His property would be seized. His reputation would be destroyed. And most importantly, his creditors would descend on him like vultures. Without his political power and his access to the treasury, Caesar would be bankrupt instantly. So in the year 50, BC, Caesar tried to negotiate. He asked the Senate to let him run for consul in absentia. He wanted to transition directly from his governorship to a new consulship without ever becoming a private citizen. He wanted to keep his immunity. The Senate refused. They demanded that he disband his army and return to Rome to face judgment. They backed him into a corner. They thought he would fold. They thought he would respect the laws of the Republic, but they forgot the financial reality. A man with nothing to lose is the most dangerous man in the world. Caesar looked at his options. Option A was to follow the law, return to Rome, lose his army, be prosecuted, go bankrupt, and die in disgrace. Option B was to keep his army, commit treason, and fight a civil war to seize the state. Option A was a guaranteed loss. Option B was a gamble, but it offered a chance of survival. This brings us to the banks of the Rubicon River in January of 49 BC. The Rubicon was a tiny stream that marked the border between the province of Cisalpine Gaul and Italy proper. By law, no general was allowed to lead an army across that river into Italy. To do so was an automatic declaration of war against the state. We are told that Caesar stood by the river and agonized over the decision. We are told he said, "Alea iacta est," the die is cast. It is a gambler's phrase. And that is fitting, because he was making the ultimate bet. He wasn't just crossing a river to become a dictator. He was crossing it to escape his balance sheet. He was invading his own country to secure a bailout. When he crossed the river, the facade of the Republic crumbled. The Senate and Pompey fled Rome in a panic. They left so quickly that they forgot to take the treasury. This is a crucial detail. When Caesar arrived in Rome, he didn't go to the Senate house to give a speech. He went to the Temple of Saturn, where the state treasury was kept. The tribunes tried to block his path. They said it was illegal for a general to touch the sacred funds. Caesar famously told the tribune that if he didn't move, he would kill him, and that doing it would be easier than saying it. He broke down the doors. He seized the gold and silver of the Republic. Why was this his first act? Because he was broke. He needed money to pay his legions. He needed money to run the state. He needed money to secure his position. The looting of Gaul was over. Now the looting of Rome began. The civil war that followed was brutal. It tore the Roman world apart. Romans fought Romans in Greece, in Africa, in Spain. Thousands died. The political structure that had stood for 5 centuries was dismantled. But underneath the battles, there was a massive debt crisis brewing in Rome. The war had caused economic chaos. Property values had crashed. Creditors were calling in loans. Debtors couldn't pay. The entire credit system of the Mediterranean was frozen. Many of Caesar's supporters had joined him specifically because they were also in debt. They hoped that if Caesar won, he would cancel all debts. They wanted a jubilee. They wanted a clean slate. They thought that because Caesar was the king of debtors, he would destroy the lenders. But once Caesar won the war and became dictator, he found himself in a difficult position. He was now the state, and the state needs a functioning economy. If he cancelled all debts, the banking system would collapse, and the wealthy class would turn against him completely. So, Caesar did something that surprised everyone. He acted like a responsible central banker. He passed a series of laws to stabilize the crisis. He ordered that property should be valued at pre-war prices. He ordered that interest payments already made should be deducted from the principal. He tried to strike a balance between the creditors and the debtors. He didn't wipe out the debt, but he made it manageable. He was trying to fix the very system that had almost destroyed him. He had solved his own financial problem by becoming the law. He no longer had to worry about creditors because he owned the courts. He no longer had to worry about money because he owned the mint. But the irony is that his financial ambition eventually killed him. By seizing absolute power, he alienated the Senate. By making himself dictator for life, he signaled that the old game of Republican politics was over. The men who assassinated him on the Ides of March were not just killing a tyrant. They were killing a man who had cheated the system. They were men like Brutus and Cassius, who believed in the old rules. They believed that no man should be above the law. But they were naive. They didn't understand that the Republic had died long before Caesar crossed the Rubicon. It had died when money became the only path to power. It had died when the cost of running for office became so high that only a criminal or a gambler could afford it. Caesar was just the symptom. The disease was the debt. The story of Caesar's bankruptcy changes how we see the Rubicon. It strips away the romance. It shows us that great historical events are often driven by mundane terrors. We imagine Caesar looking across the river and seeing a vision of Rome's future glory. But perhaps he was looking across the river and seeing a vision of a debtor's prison. Perhaps he marched on Rome not because he felt like a god, but because he felt like a cornered animal. It forces us to ask uncomfortable questions about our own leaders. When we see politicians making decisions that seem irrational or dangerous, we should look at their finances. We should look at who they owe money to. Are they starting a war to defend the nation or to defend their portfolio? Are they passing a law to help the people or to help their donors? The Roman Republic fell because the political class became addicted to debt. They built a system where ambition required vast sums of money, and where the only way to repay that money was to plunder the state. Caesar was the ultimate product of that system. He was the most successful failure in history. He failed to play by the rules because the rules guaranteed his bankruptcy. So he flipped the board. The legacy of the Rubicon is not just military, it is financial. It teaches us that when the debt becomes too big to pay the rules, no longer apply. When a small man goes broke, he goes to jail. When a giant goes broke, he goes to war. The empire that rose from the ashes of the Republic was built on this foundation. It was an empire where the emperor owned everything so he could never be in debt. It was a solution to the problem, but it cost the Romans their freedom. So, the next time you hear the phrase crossing the Rubicon, don't think of a hero making a bold choice. Think of a man looking at a pile of unpaid bills and deciding that burning down the world was a better option than paying them. History is written by the victors, but the logic of history is written by the accountants. And in the end, the math always wins. The debt must be paid one way or another. Caesar paid it with the blood of the Republic, and eventually he paid it with his own.